So I got my design approval back from LVV. No dramas really. They've just sort of come back and said that just basic stuff really, that it needs to have bump stops in it, that the whole front end will need to have a custom independent front suspension design approval, which is just another form to fill out, which I expected to have to do that anyway. That the rockers should be mounted in double shear, which seems kind of dumb anyway for how I would have designed the mounting, but that's fine. We can do something with that. And then just to, pretty much, they just passed the buck, really. They just say that it is suggested that the whole system be mocked together and that the actual certifier comes and checks it over to make sure everything works properly. So, yeah, pretty much, as my certifier did say as well, it's kind of backwards. He was like, I think you can do it, but I can't tell you that you're allowed to do it. And then these guys have said, you're allowed to do it, but he needs to check it that it's done properly. So it's kind of like, yeah, what comes first, chicken or the egg? But that's all right. We can go ahead. So I'll get into some bits and bobs and keep you updated. Not much progress on the ute lately, been just flat out with customers' cars, but have just roughly mocked up some arms that are kind of the length and layout that I'm going to run, and a couple mounts onto the chassis just to confirm all my drawings. It's always good to just put it in place to make sure it's all going to work, and real happy with it. Seems to be working really well. This is still kind of weird looking because it's quite high off the chassis, but I kind of need room under the arm to be able to make the rocker, so I think it's going to work all right. There's still the possibility of raising that chassis rail up a bit, but I'm going to mock up a rocker and kind of see what I think about the look. But yeah, so that's all working real well. I'm real happy with the camber gain or lack of that it has, because before with the old arms it had so much camber on bump, but now probably hard to tell exactly, but it practically has no camber gain through its travel, so you probably could kind of see there. So that's wicked. That's going to help heaps with bump steer and all those other bits, plus it just doesn't look ridiculous when it's either up or down. I can set it to have a bit of camber and it's going to stay there whether I'm right up or right down, so happy as with that. Just one other thing I'm looking at now is the sort of rack position and the steering arm angle. So at the moment the steering arm bolts to the hub, sorry, the rack end angle, not the steering arm angle, which is another reason why I went for these Mazda Bounty hubs. So at the moment, yeah, that steering arm bolts to the hub, and then the tie rod end bolts to the top of the steering arm, this is the other side hub. So that would bolt on like so, with the taper in from the top, and the rack end sits in from the top. So what I'm about to do is chuck this in the lathe. If I had a mill it would be handy, but put this in the lathe. Thankfully there's quite a big surface area here, so for LVV you're allowed to modify this as long as there's, I think it's 6 or 8 mil of flat surface around the outside of the hole. So I've got plenty there, so that's sweet. So I'm going to chuck this in the forejaw and reverse this taper in the steering arm. So instead of the rack end bolting on from the top, it'll bolt on from the bottom, which is going to drop that angle down significantly. It's kind of hard to see on the angle, but at the moment that's kind of pointing straight at the middle of the chassis rail. So I can drop that point down towards the rim, and it's going to flatten out the rack end angle heaps and help the bump steer, so I can get it kind of in the same plane as the bottom arm so they all sort of move through the same arc, which cut down. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to have any bump steer, but it's a good point to start at, and then we can adjust it from there. The other possibility is, which I may end up doing, not this one, this is just came with a steering kit, but you can, for LVV, and I've done it in the past, you're allowed to machine I don't know what you call that, shaft, with a parallel section and run a rose joint as the outer joint rather than the standard ball joint. And then you can space this, well, I'd probably use something like this and then just put washers in it to space the rack end up and down to then get the bump steer right, and then machine up one of these with a solid tapered, solid parallel section in here to get the spacing right, to then put a rod end on there. So that's a good option. Makes life a lot easier and adjustable, so you can get the bump steer bang on, because they are pretty finicky about bump steer, and I'll have to do a bump steer suite, bump steer test, and provide all the information about that. So doing something like that gives you great adjustability and you can get it bang on, so that's cool. But yeah, for now, this morning I'm just going to play around and reverse this taper. So yeah, come over to my lathe. I've got the big old 4-jaw there that I'm about to have to lug up onto the lathe, and then I can set this up, grip it in the middle, and reverse this taper. So that's the mission this morning. Oh, hopefully don't put me back out trying to lift that up. Pretty happy with that. It's not to the thou perfectly in the middle, but it's pretty close for what I'm doing anyway, because I'm going to bore the whole hole out, so, and the hole isn't necessarily dead center of that casting anyway, so it's going to be sweet. So I'll set up my boring bar at my 4 degrees, I think it is, and bore the hole out. So here's a rough, very, very rough mock-up of the rocker, pushrod and shock layout. Pretty happy with how it's looking. So as you can see from this angle, we've got the shock, the rocker and the pushrods all nicely in line with each other. And yeah, it all seems to work pretty well. Pretty happy with it. Had to space the rocker quite far up off the chassis rail to get a decent angle between the bottom arm and the pushrod, because if it was down too low, the angle between the pushrod and the bottom arm was way too steep, and it kind of didn't really give a positive movement to the rocker for the arm movement. So having it up like that seems to work quite well. Obviously that's on a pretty big angle anyway, but that's slammed right out, so it's not really going to be doing a lot when it's right down there. But yeah, pretty stoked. Looks pretty good. Ended up doing the rocker is set up pretty much at 1-to-1 at the moment, and as for movement at the shock versus movement at the wheel, it's slightly over, so it's about 100 mil of travel at the shock to about 130 mil or 120 mil of travel at the wheel, so that's pretty good. I'm happy with the amount of travel at the wheel. I don't think I really need a lot more than that 130 mil, so you can see it through its travel there is pretty positive, pretty linear, sort of has good movement from the shock versus the bottom arm throughout its travel, which is pretty good. You can get some weird stuff happen where it's sort of 1-to-1 in some areas, and then it can kind of taper off, and you can get a lot of movement at the hub and not a lot of movement at the shock, but that seems to be pretty linear at that layout. So yeah, stoked on that. I think Yeah, don't quite know exactly what my next step will be. Maybe make a rocker and a mount for the end of the shock, so I can sort of dummy it together a bit better. I think I'll probably still lift that section of the chassis rail up, just because those top arm mounts are so tall, and then the rocker's kind of out in the middle of nowhere as well. So I think if I raise the whole chassis rail up a bit, it'll make the brackets sort of not look as out in no man's land. So I think possibly I'll look at doing that now, cut that front section of the chassis rail out and lift it up maybe